Good evening, everybody. For this week's assignment of an entrepreneur from 1900 to 1929, I've decided to focus on Henry Ford, and I found a lovely quote to open the paper that describes the world in which he was born into. Henry Ford came into the world on July 30th, 1863, when the smoke had barely cleared from the Battle of Gettysburg, when Queen Victoria and Napoleon III were in the middle of their reigns, and before the electric light bulb, the telephone, or the phonograph had been invented. End quote. Henry Ford was born in Spring Wells Township near Detroit, which is also near Dearborn, the town that he would become associated with, and it with him. Henry Ford's father gave him a pocket watch around the time Henry was 12, and he began to tinker with the watch, disassembling and reassembling the watch. Henry was a lifelong tinkerer, and by the age of 15, he was repairing watches in his neighborhood. While he had a series of jobs in different industries prior to establishing his Ford Motor Company, it was the watch repair that gave him his breakthrough idea. He wanted to design and build a product for the masses that they could afford. He went to work for the Westinghouse Steam Engine Company, which taught him how pistons worked. 2 years later, he went to work for Edison Illuminating Company, and while there, he built his first functional combustion engine powered car. A few years later, he founded the Detroit Automotive Company. The company only lasted 2 years. He had to close the company because the production of the automobiles was far too expensive for the average individual, but it taught him a valuable lesson about production. He then went to work for the Dodge Brothers, and after that, a company that would eventually be known as Cadillac. On July 16, 1903, the Ford Motor Company was born. Henry Ford had jumped around from company to company for over 15 years, and all along the way, he acquired knowledge everywhere he went. It was that broad base of knowledge that helped him become one of the most successful car makers of his time. From management to machinery, Henry Ford's many different jobs provided him with the knowledge of every aspect of car making. He debuted his Model T in 1908 at an initial cost of $825, and by 1916 he was able to drop the price to under $400, or 2 months' pay for a Ford factory employee. In today's money, that would be the equivalent of a car that cost under $11,000 to the consumer. 2 years later, 50% of all cars in the United States were his Ford Model Ts. Now, there are two reasons for this. One was the simplicity of Ford's car design. The Model T was a simple car that lacked the modern luxuries that we've all come to associate with our cars. It didn't have air conditioning, didn't have heat, didn't have power windows or power steering. That's one reason he was able to keep that price so low. The second reason was the assembly line. Now, despite popular misconceptions, Ford did not invent the assembly line, but he did perfect the concept. He actually had two teams of employees building a car, one using the assembly line and one where they all gathered the parts in one spot and worked as teams. He found that the assembly line was much faster. Ford not only popularized the assembly line for his automobiles, eventually every major industry in America used it to produce almost every finished product, from canned foods to soda to packaging. It became the most efficient way to do everything. Now, the problem Ford encountered is it's incredibly boring to work on an assembly line. So to keep his workers from quitting, Ford raised the pay to $5 a day, which was double the going rate of any factory worker of his time. In the booming 1920s, mass marketing and mass production of automobiles changed America forever. With this new generation of drivers came the need for paved roads, fill-up stations, repair stations, all to service these cars. And once again, half of them are Fords. So Ford helped not only to modernize transportation, but to create whole new lines of employment connected. These are multipliers. Through the 1920s, Ford was heralded as the modern version of the self-made man, yet his reputation was tarnished by three events. First were a series of lawsuits in response to his reprintings of the Protocols of Electric Design in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. This was a newspaper he published, and every car dealership that bore the name Ford had to sell subscriptions to it. And remember, half the cars in America at this time were his. The second was the overproduction of his Model T. Ford believed that his measure of success was outproducing his competition to say that as many people as he could were driving his car. Unfortunately, Ford's desire contributed to the Great Depression by flooding the market with cars that could not be sold. In the spring of 1927, Ford had to shut down his Michigan River Rouge factory for 6 weeks, and that left 40,000 workers unemployed while he retooled for a new model. In August of 1931, the Ford Motor Company, Detroit's largest employer, stopped making cars for an entire summer. This was due to a decrease in demand due to the Great Depression, a condition Ford helped create. Now, 60,000 Ford employees were out of work, and they joined the already 100,000 unemployed workers in Detroit. The third was Ford's connection to Adolf Hitler of Germany. In 1922, the New York Times reported that Henry Ford had bankrolled Hitler. Hitler denied receiving funds from Ford, but Hitler did have copies of Ford's Dearborn Independent newspaper in his office, and he used them to create his attacks on Jews. Ford's only son, Edsel, died in 1943 from stomach cancer, and Henry Ford, in his old age, was forced to come out of retirement and run his company again. 18 months later, he was forced out by his own board because he'd nearly bankrupted his company. Ford died 2 years later in 1947. Thank you.